Hope's Watch kind of fills a void that came about because Elle, who is the best friend of the main character from A Change of Plans, Lynn, you find out later in the story about Elle being married, but you never get to see how she met her husband and how they eventually came together. And so Hope's Watch is a way to give readers an opportunity to see just a little bit of how that came about. I hope you enjoy it.
Hope's Watch is the story of Lynn's friend, Elle. It takes place in American Samoa right after the catamaran goes missing. If you haven't read A Change of Plans yet, you'll enjoy this novelette more if you do.
Hope's Watch. Safe Harbors number 1.5. Written by Donna K. Weaver. Narrated by Tristan Hunt. Chapter 1. Elle stared at the blood smeared on her hands. The light of the retreating Coast Guard helicopter made it seem like she starred in a ghastly horror film. But as she stood on the deck of the captured pirate ship, Elle didn't feel like a movie heroine. The memory of Yori's mangled cheek turned her stomach. She looked up at the disappearing spot of light, the wop-wop-wop of the chopper fading as it flew her friend to the hospital in American Samoa. Could he die from a rifle butt to the face? A burst of wind made Elle shiver in the still damp borrowed t-shirt. Yori's shirt, the one he had given her to cover her near nakedness. Wrapping herself with her arms, she wished for her bikini top. It was still on the catamaran, somewhere on the dark ocean, with her best friend Lynn. Elle peered into the darkness, but the lights of the Coast Guard cutter in the near distance blinded her to anything but it. She couldn't shake a powerful sense of guilt. She was safe, rescued. Lynn was lost at sea. Elle's lips trembled. She moved to press her fingers against them, but stopped when she remembered the blood. With an almost manic intensity, she rubbed her hands against the shirt, as if by wiping them clean she could make all the rest of it go away. "It's time for you to board, ma'am." A Coast Guard sailor gestured for her. She saw the last of the 16 freed prisoners climbing over the rusty railing of the pirate ship. Afraid she might be left behind, Elle hurried over. When she came full into the cutter's spotlight, the guardsman raised a hand. "Is that blood? Are you hurt?" "It's not mine." Elle pointed in the direction the helicopter had gone. "It's his." Her voice sounded strange, even to her. "You'll have to get cleaned up first, ma'am." The sailor pulled out a hand radio. "I'm gonna need another blood kit." After she washed her hands, Elle took the coverall the sailor handed her. Self-conscious, she turned around and ripped the t-shirt over her head and stepped into the garment. She put the tainted clothes in the bag and faced him. He signaled for her to climb down the ladder and into the inflatable raft that would take them to the Coast Guard boat. When she boarded the cutter, the other rescued captives looked at her, eyes dull. Their expressions reminded Elle of the pictures of people when the Twin Towers had fallen. Dazed, confused, like it couldn't be real. A sailor handed Elle a water bottle and a packet of crackers. She took them and sat down. Had it only been yesterday that she and Lynn had eaten breakfast together on the cruise ship, talking about going snorkeling for the first time? Except for a snack of fruits and juices on the way to the snorkeling stops, she hadn't had anything to eat. She forced down the tasteless crackers, glad when they relieved some of her lightheadedness. Huddling into herself, Elle tried not to think, not to keep reliving it all over and over again. Where was the catamaran? Was Lynn alive? Elle sniffed, choking back a sob. She scanned the haggard group of friends and caught several glances, as though they were looking at her for a cue on how to react. If she lost it, would they? Closing her eyes, Elle leaned back her head. Sure, she had taken charge on the cruise ship, pulling together this group of strangers, and they had become friends. She was good at that kind of thing, but she was a party planner, not a trauma specialist. Elle opened her eyes and inhaled deeply. No, she wouldn't cry in front of them, not if they needed her to be strong. But steeling her face didn't calm her mind. All she thought about was how she could possibly go back to the cruise ship without Lynn. By the time Elle recognized American Samoa in the distance, the sun was bright overhead. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Nightmarish images had jerked her awake every time she had fallen asleep. The ocean traffic seemed much busier than when they had left early the day before. The sound of an approaching low-flying helicopter reminded her of Yori. Had he made it? She raised an arm against the sun's glare and recognized TV call numbers on the chopper's side. The other passengers roused at the sound and mumbled about being on the news. The news? They must be nearly 24 hours overdue. Did her parents know she had been missing? Elle held her hands against her stomach. Braden, one of the men missing on the catamaran, had a sister who was still on the ship. How could Elle tell the woman her brother was missing? The size of the crowd gathered on the dock surprised Elle. It took both the police and Coast Guard to keep the mass of people back, while the victims were herded from the cutter to a bus that had been brought for the occasion. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions at them until they were safely on board. Elle was glad to be wearing the coverall, which made her look like one of the guardsmen. At the government office, she sat through question after question. Fatigue made her feel loopy and cranky. They kept asking about things that made her throat close up. One thought stayed with her. She had to call her parents. "Can I make a phone call?" Elle asked for what had to be the 10th time. "When we're finished." He then asked her a question she had already answered. "I already told you that." "It's important to get your complete statement while the memories are fresh." The man leaned forward, his hands on the table. "This was a serious crime." Like he had to tell her that. A dozen snarky comments came to mind, but she closed her eyes. "Crooks get a phone call, right?" She looked at him. "Shouldn't I get one? Remember, I'm a victim here." "Please, Miss Reinhardt, when we're finished here, you can make all the phone calls you want." The man then proceeded to ask her another question she had already answered. Elle closed down, folding her arms, refusing to answer anything. She stared at the calendar on the wall and tried to think of something, anything that wouldn't make her cry. The guy stopped talking and tried some kind of stupid staring thing. Fine. She was the queen of stubborn. The thought made her think of Lynn and how when they had been little, each had been determined not to answer to her birth name. "Don't cry." "All right." He closed his notebook. "If you remember anything else, please write it down. We may also need you to come in to identify your attackers." The idea of looking at any of those vile men again turned her stomach. The tears she had been fighting filled her eyes. The man coughed and stood, picking up his pen and papers. "You're free to go." He left the room. As she wiped her eyes, a sudden urgency filled her. She hurried behind him and then dashed into a nearby elevator before the doors could close. Her mother must be frantic by now. Elle had to get back to the ship for her phone. When the doors opened again on the main floor, she came face to face with Braden's sister, Ashlyn, her husband and young daughter at her side, waiting for the elevator. Ashlyn's eyes met Elle's, and both women burst into tears. Ashlyn's husband, Darcy, put a hand on each of their shoulders but didn't say anything. When Elle stopped crying, she realized Kate clung to their legs. "Mommy, why are we crying?" The little girl looked up, her eyes wide and wet. "Oh, baby." Ashlyn dropped to her knees and pulled her daughter into her arms. "We're just happy Elle's safe." "It was a pretty bad storm she got caught in," Darcy said, kneeling beside his wife and daughter. "I know. You said that's why Uncle Bray is late." Kate wiped her face on her mother's blouse and looked up at Elle. "The boat got lost, but the—" She looked at her father and he gave her the words. "Coast Guard is going to bring them back." Elle blinked at the child's simple faith. Darcy rose, giving his wife a hand to her feet. "Let's go get you one of those." He took his daughter's hand and he walked while she skipped toward a gumball machine near the building entrance. "We're trying to keep as much from her as we can," Ashlyn said. She took Elle's arm. "It's been hard, though. She's like a little emotion sensor and seems to pick up on every little nuance. I don't know what we're going to tell her if—" "Don't say it," Elle broke in, feeling a sudden panic. "Don't even think it. They're going to find them." Ashlyn nodded and gave a weak smile. Kate scrambled after a wildly bouncing ball through the door her father held open. The two women hurried to follow her. "They held the cruise ship last night when you guys didn't come back," Darcy said when they caught up to him. "It's sailing in a few hours, so you need to get your things." "How can they do that?" Elle had never considered the ship leaving without them. "They already held it a day and interrupted the vacations of over 1,000 people. They won't hold it longer for 4 people. Darcy didn't look happy. "We'll help." Ashlyn patted Elle's arm. "We've got our things off already, and we have a rental car." When they got to the ship, Elle was surprised to find she was the first from the disastrous excursion to return. A couple of ship's officers escorted her and the Armstrongs to her room. She was grateful when Ashlyn got busy on Lynn's things. Elle didn't know what Darcy had to do to get permission, but she and Darcy were able to sign a detailed list of Yori's belongings. A steward then brought the luggage to the hallway outside Elle's door, where they waited with hers and Lynn's stuff. It was just as well she had gotten there first, because they were the last to disembark. The others huddled together around a handful of white uniformed people, standing just inside a large building on the dock. Darcy whispered that one was the captain and pointed him out. The white-haired man greeted them and expressed sorrow for the tragedy. His executive officer then handed them all cards with contact information for cruise line representatives, who would help them with accommodations and plane tickets home. When he was finished, the group headed back to the ship. Elle turned around to watch. A huge crowd of passengers had gathered along the rail. A few raised their hands. They seemed to be looking at her. Peering closer, she thought she recognized them. People she had talked to during the cruise who must remember her. She lifted her hand, her eyes moist. "You ready?" Darcy asked, and then muttered something about avoiding lawsuits. How could they know the captain's employees would kill him and take his passengers hostage? Ashlyn pitched her voice low, her eyes darting to Kate. They walked in silence the rest of the way to the rental car. Elle sat in the back seat by Kate. As much as she had wanted earlier to talk to her parents, Elle now stared at the cell phone in her hand. She had a signal, and she had a charge. It was time to make some hard phone calls. It was like Elle was back to that night over a year ago when she had sat in Lynn's apartment, calling their mutual friends to tell them Lynn's fiancé had been killed in a car crash. It had been one of the hardest things Elle had ever been through, until now. Maybe she could get her dad to break the news to Lynn's parents. The cell rang and Elle jumped. The phone went flying. She barely caught it before it fell to the floor. When she recognized the number, Elle accepted the call, all reserve gone. "Oh, Mom," she bawled. "Honey, are you all right?" her mother asked when Elle stopped crying. "I'm okay, really," she sniffed, aware of Kate beside her. The little girl slid her hand into Elle's. "I'm on my way to the hotel with some friends from the ship." "When are you coming home?" "When they find Lynn. Then your dad and I are coming to be with you." "No, Mom, don't." There was a part of Elle that would have loved to let her parents take care of her, but they always treated her like she was still a little kid. Around them, she would have to fight to be seen as an adult. Her mother continued to argue, but Elle held firm. "Well, if you're sure," Mrs. Reinhardt finally sighed. "I talked to Tammy North. She and Russ are coming out." Elle breathed easier. Lynn's parents already knew. Elle wondered how Tammy would be. When Lynn's fiancé Jace had died, she had needed more emotional support than Lynn had. "We're at the hotel, Mom. Give Dad a hug for me, okay? I'll let you know as soon as I hear something. I love you." She took her hand from Kate's to turn off the phone. Elle leaned over and kissed the top of the child's head. Ashlyn reached back with a tissue. "Thanks," Elle said. "Have you told your father?" She knew Ashlyn's mother had died earlier in the year. "He'll be here later tonight." Ashlyn's eyes were red as she bent to help Kate out of the car, but she gave her daughter a big grin. "You'll get to see Grandpa, won't you?" "That's fast." Elle checked the paperwork with information about the hotel where the cruise line had made arrangements for them. She would have a room to herself. "Can you let me know when you go to the airport?" Elle asked. Ashlyn nodded and turned to follow Kate, who was tugging her toward the building. Elle was impressed with how well the little girl seemed to be taking the disappearance of her uncle, and hoped she hadn't said anything that might upset the child. Stepping out of the car, Elle stumbled and had to cling to the door. It was more than physical fatigue. She was used up. Braden's father and Lynn's parents were coming to American Samoa. Elle said a silent prayer that the catamaran with its 4 passengers would be found before then. Chapter 2. Elle jolted awake to another nightmare, her heart racing so fast she thought it might explode. Every time she fell asleep, she saw it again. Yori pushing her behind him as she struggled into his t-shirt, the pirate yelling at them, of the rifle butt hitting that beautiful face, Yori's blood on her hands. Her mouth went dry. Was he okay? She hadn't even thought to ask anyone about him since they had returned. Elle picked up the room phone and rang the front desk. They gave her the number of the LBJ Tropical Medical Center. Then she discovered that American Samoa conformed to U.S. privacy laws. The hospital staff would only confirm that Yori was there and listed in critical condition. She used her anger to mask her fear and was still fuming when someone knocked on the hotel room door. A quick look through the peephole showed Ashlyn. "Any news?" Elle asked, ripping open the door. Ashlyn shook her head, the dark shadows under her eyes more pronounced. Elle wondered if the woman was also having trouble sleeping. "You asked us to let you know when we left for the airport," Ashlyn said. "Would you like me to watch Kate for you?" "She's too excited to see her grandpa to sleep." Ashlyn turned and made a shushing sound. "Can I come?" Elle asked, overcome with a desire for company. "I don't think I can sleep anyway." "Of course." Once the plane landed, it didn't take long for the passengers to disembark. As soon as Elle saw Jack Randolph, she knew him as Braden's father. Not as tall as his son or built as big, the resemblance between the two men was still pronounced. Little Kate leapt into his arms, and he squeezed her tight to his chest, turning a hard, questioning gaze on his daughter. Ashlyn's eyes watered and she shook her head. "You can come with me to get my suitcase." He put his granddaughter down and took her hand. "Elle, this is my dad, Jack Randolph. Dad, this is Elle Reinhardt. The older man gave Elle a curt nod and pulled Kate along with him. Elle stood with her mouth formed around the beginning of a greeting. Braden's dad was a real charmer. "Don't take it personally," a pleasant male voice said behind her. Spinning around, Elle saw Darcy throw his arms around the speaker. "Good of you to come, Mal," Darcy said, his voice rougher than Elle had ever heard it. "I thought you'd get off with Jack." He looked preoccupied, so I didn't bother him. The other man shrugged, his head turned to where Jack stood talking to Kate next to the baggage carousel. "Still no news?" Mal glanced back, his voice soft, attention now on his sister-in-law who stood a few feet away, looking a little lost. "We're trying to keep our spirits up. Ashlyn's having a hard time." Darcy looked at Elle. "Sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you. This is my kid brother, Mal, Elle Reinhardt." The tall man, tall for Elle anyway, held out his hand. He reminded her a little of a guy she had dated a few years ago. It hadn't ended well. Just what she needed on top of Braden's nightmarish father and Lynn's needy mother was this urbane man with his button-down shirt and crumpled but expensive trousers. If her own parents showed up, she might shoot someone. "So, Elle," Mal asked, "how do you know my brother?" Darcy leaned in before she could answer and said softly, "She was on the catamaran." "I'm so sorry." Mal's neck darkened. He snapped his mouth shut, shooting his brother a glare. At first, Elle had looked at this Mal as an intruder and felt an uncharacteristic sense of satisfaction that he didn't seem so smooth anymore. But his flushed face reminded her of Darcy. Ashamed, she looked at her feet, the irritation gone. "Don't worry about it," Elle said. "Did you know anyone on the boat?" His tone was kind. Blinking, she nodded and pointed to the carousel. "I guess you should get your luggage, too." Darcy left immediately, but Mal sent her another sympathetic look before hurrying after his brother. She had to calm her breathing before joining them. If she didn't get a better grip on her emotions, she wouldn't be any help to Lynn's mother. Once Jack and Mal had retrieved their bags, everyone crowded into the rental car, Kate sitting between her grandfather and Elle in the back seat. The older man still hadn't said a word to her. With a sigh, she closed her eyes and leaned her head against the window. When Elle turned on the television the next morning, she found out why Mal had come all the way to American Samoa. He stood outside the hotel, talking to the press. Was it live? She turned off the blow-dryer and sat on a chair to watch. They introduced him as the family spokesman. Urbane, yes, in his dressy, casual clothes. Slim khaki slacks, black crewneck shirt, and an obviously tailored charcoal jacket. Elle had to admit he looked really nice. How could anyone seem so at ease while people pointed cameras at him? She thought back to Mal's first comment to her. With his smooth voice and pleasant demeanor, he probably made friends easily. Elle jumped to her feet and went back to the bathroom and her blow-dryer. He was not like her. Later that afternoon, she borrowed the Armstrongs' rental car to go to the airport to pick up the Norths. The first thing Lynn's mother did was to throw her arms around Elle and sob. It took all her strength of will not to cry too. She knew Tammy well enough. If Elle cried too, they would never quit. By the time she got them to the hotel and checked into their room, it was time for dinner. It took a little convincing to get Tammy to come. In many ways, Lynn was a lot like her mother. Tall, dark, slender, hater of crowds. When Elle had first proposed the cruise, she'd had to promise that Lynn would have plenty of quiet time. "This way." Elle pointed to the large table where Ashlyn's extended family had gathered in the hotel dining room. "They're just sitting down." "Can't we eat alone?" The woman hesitated, frowning. "They're good people," Elle said, feeling suddenly defensive. "We need to support each other. Remember, they have someone on the catamaran, too. Braden is a friend." Her voice broke on that last word. Lynn's father squeezed Elle's shoulder and gently took his wife's elbow. Ashlyn's family watched them expectantly. "This is all very expensive, you know," Tammy said. "We'll be okay, sweetheart." Russ put his arm around his wife's shoulders, guiding her toward the table. "I'm sorry, I'm just so worried." Elle moved ahead so she would be in a position to introduce them. Mal's attention shifted from the Norths to Elle. He shot her a look of sympathy. She wished he would stop that. "Everyone," she said, "this is Russ and Tammy North, Lynn's parents." Elle went through the introductions and waited for the others to sit before taking a chair beside Tammy. With relief, Elle watched as Ashlyn immediately drew the older woman into a conversation. Lynn's mother, once forced into a social situation, did fine, just like Lynn would have done. Elle glanced up and caught Mal watching her. He gave her a smile and turned to the waiter. Why did he always seem to be watching her? Or was she being paranoid? Maybe Mal was like Braden, who was fascinated with people and loved to watch them. She gave her order and turned her attention to the others at the table. Jack had pulled out a pen and was writing on a piece of paper. Kate looked up from it and said something to him Elle couldn't hear. It both irritated and fascinated her that Braden's father could blow her off, yet be so sweet with the child. From the little girl's other side, Mal whispered something, and Kate shook her head, appearing to disagree. He winked at her. After a little gasp, she slapped his arm, apparently only understanding then that he had been teasing her. He lifted his eyes and caught Elle watching him that time. She turned towards Lynn's parents, trying to pick up the conversation. "Chevy makes a good NASCAR car," Russ said to Darcy before taking a drink from his water glass. "It can't be." Tammy leaned a little closer to Ashlyn, who turned toward the restaurant entrance. "The Charger's better." Darcy sat back and crossed his arms as though preparing for a long debate. "I think it is." Ashlyn stretched up to see better. "No," Jack said. "He must be filming here." Tammy almost looked excited. "They skinned the Gen 6 NASCAR," Russ said. "Buy fertilizer," Jack said. "It's the inside that counts," Darcy said. Caught in the middle of 3 discussions, Elle blinked at the way the comments intermingled. She coughed to cover a giggle. If Lynn had been there, they would have laughed together about it. Elle's eyes fell on Mal, where he sat with his arms comfortably folded across his chest, his eyes going between the people at the table. His eyes sparkled, his shoulders shaking. Handsome, but not tall. Tammy didn't quite sigh. I knew he wasn't tall, Ashlyn said. But someone that gorgeous should be tall, Tammy said. I want a pink house. Kate shook her head.
The game's not about your house color. We have to save that goddess.
Elle's eyes widened. Cranky old Jack was playing a video game with his granddaughter? Elle looked up and found Mal watching her, his eyes wide. He put his hand over his mouth, and she was sure he was trying not to laugh, too. The tightness in her chest eased, and she was grateful for the relief of a little humor. The relief didn't last long, though. How could Elle find anything funny? Was Lynn laughing, wherever she was? The waiter appeared then at her side and put a plate in front of her. The smell of the rich food wafted up, turning her stomach. With a grimace, Elle pushed away the plate. If she tried to eat it, she would throw up. A basket of bread edged toward her plate from across the table. Mal gave it one more push. Can you get down some bread? Had she been that obvious? She was supposed to be the one who took care of people. Elle picked up her fork, stabbed a clump of vegetables, and shoved it in her mouth. Mal didn't quite smile. Pulling back the basket a little and choosing a roll from it, he turned toward Kate. Elle set down her fork. The vegetable sat like a brick in her stomach. With a sigh, she reached for one of the rolls, glancing around the table. This was a social situation that nothing in her past had prepared her for. She tore a piece of the bread, chewed it, and tried to find enough saliva to swallow it. After a gloomy evening spent in the Armstrongs' joint suite, where everyone pretended to watch a movie, Elle vowed to do better the next day. She had to find a balance between comfortable camaraderie and the hope-eating worry that possessed the group. Mother Nature didn't cooperate. Elle woke the next morning to the sound of rain on her hotel window. She stared out at the heavy downpour, the winds buffeting the few people venturous enough to brave the weather. If it was like this here, how bad was it at sea, where the search was going on? She hoped the Coast Guard wouldn't call off the search. Finally, she tore herself away from the window and called the hospital again. They wouldn't give her any more information. It only added to the tight lump in her gut. If Yuri was still in critical condition, his injuries were worse than just the terrible gash on his face. She stopped by the North's room, and they went to the breakfast buffet together, where the Armstrongs and Jack were already seated. Ashlyn gave them a wave over. Everyone at the table looked as glum as Russ and Tammy, and Elle wasn't sure she was glad for the invitation. Do you want something to drink? Elle asked the Norths after she set down her plate. Everyone at the table requested something, so she pulled a pen from her purse and wrote down their orders on a napkin. I'll help you carry all that, Mal said. Okay, thanks. He didn't say anything while he helped her fill several glasses. It wasn't until she had loaded the North's drinks on the tray that he finally asked, How are you doing today? I'm fine. Elle hesitated, looking back at the table where everyone ate quietly. It was like the storm outside had stolen even the little energy it took to make small talk. She turned to Mal. How's Ashlyn doing? She had a rough night. Mal let out a deep breath, and like he had removed a mask, the calm expression faded into one of fatigue and worry. Elle didn't know what to say. Ditto? Where are you from? Mal asked, apparently to change the topic. Colorado Springs. You? New York. He took a new glass from the tray and held it out to her. You getting juice? Milk. Elle accepted it, and he picked up the tray. Turning around, she crashed into the chest of a tall man, the long dreadlocks hanging over one shoulder getting in her eye. Her cup went flying into the air, and he caught it, a huge grin on his face. Nice of you to run into me, Elle, he said with a grin. Wes! Elle threw her arms around his waist. Ow, not so hard. Wes cringed, gasping as he held his body rigid, his arms held out to the side. I have a broken rib. Oh, I'm sorry. She let go of him and covered her mouth with her hands. Elle's giving out hugs? Ryan said. You never would take part in Lynn's self-defense classes on the ship, so I never had an excuse. Now it's my turn. When the shorter man swept her into his arms for a quick hug, Elle noticed Mal hovering in the background, still holding the tray. He watched the two men warily. Mal, this is Wes and Ryan. She stepped back so the four of them formed a misshapen circle. They were on the cruise. Elle reached up to touch the bandage on Wes's chin, but stopped.
4 stitches.
Wes handed her back the glass and said to Mal,
You look like you could be related to Darcy.
He's my brother. Mal put down the tray and extended his hand.
Nice to meet you.
Wes turned to Elle.
Heard anything about Yori?
No. You? He shook his head and she blinked, unable to speak.
Yeah, I get that.
Wes patted her arm.
We won't keep you. I'll let you know if I hear anything.
The two turned and made their way toward the exit. Wes was hurt by the pirates? Mal picked up the tray again. Yes. Elle filled her glass. He tried to jump one by himself. And this Yori, he's the one in the hospital. I don't want to talk about it. All right? There was no way Mal could understand. No problem. Mal walked past her. She followed him to the table where he was already handing out the drinks. The rain pounding against the dining room windows seemed to beat in rhythm with the pressure in her head. Mal sat beside Kate and didn't look Elle's way. Chapter 3. Her tension continued to rise throughout the day. Tammy was so emotionally fragile that Elle hadn't brought up the issue of Lynn's luggage. Every time Elle entered the room, she saw them. She stayed in her room as little as possible. Gathered in the Armstrong suite, they were all on edge anyway, and being trapped inside by weather didn't help. Elle had tried to walk around the common areas of the hotel, but the press outside kept trying to get her attention through the glass. It kind of creeped her out that they recognized her. Sitting not far behind Jack as he clicked through the TV stations again, Elle kept her hands under her legs. More than once that evening she had nearly smacked the man in the back of the head and demanded he surrender the remote. Not a violent person, she wondered if she might be going crazy. Tammy, I think we should call it a night, Russ said, reaching his hand toward his wife. Lynn's mother rubbed her bloodshot eyes. It won't do any good to sit in that room alone. I can't sleep anyway. The poor woman looked about to cry again. In the past, Elle's instincts had always guided her in how to make things better. If people weren't socializing, she had ways to get them to talk. Elle could create the perfect ambiance for any situation. Until now. Now she was useless. They all stressed if the phone didn't ring. They jumped if it did. No one wanted to be left to their own thoughts, but none of them could concentrate on anything. When Jack paused in his channel surfing, Elle shifted her attention to the television. Anything was better than more tears. She wouldn't be able to keep it together much longer. The news broadcaster was giving an update on the excursion. The picture behind the man was of Yori. The cruise line must have provided it, because it looked like it had been taken at one of the formal nights, since he wore a tux. Elle jumped off the bar stool, her throat tight. Ashlyn, can I borrow your car? I have to get out of here. The woman gave her a concerned look from where she sat on the floor helping Kate with a complicated puzzle. Of course. Ashlyn took her time getting to her feet, never taking her eyes off Elle. Ashlyn pulled the keys from her purse. Sure you don't want to rest in your room? Rest? Alone with her nightmares? Elle bit back a laugh, fearing it would turn hysterical. You'll be careful? Ashlyn peered at her. It's still raining out there. I will. Elle took the keys and grabbed her purse from the bar. Outside the hotel room, she stood for a second and took a deep breath. It was almost as though she could feel the anxiety pulsing through the door. Elle hurried to the elevator. As she was about to push the button, a ding from above announced its arrival to the floor. The doors opened and she stepped aside to let the occupant exit. Hey, Elle, you going somewhere? Mal stood in the elevator car watching her. Couldn't she just have some peace and quiet? She put on her I'm so happy to see you face and hoped her agitation didn't show. I'm going to the hospital. Want some company? The elevator dinged to indicate the door was still open and Mal stepped out. I'm running out of excuses not to go back in there. When she hesitated, he heaved a sigh. Don't worry about it. He shoved his hands in his pockets and moved past her and toward the suite. There was something so vulnerable in Mal's posture as he walked away. Elle's heart twisted a little as she recognized it. This man had come halfway across the world in support of his brother. Not once had she considered how awkward everything must be for him. Maybe she could handle his company if he kept quiet. "Hey, Mal," Elle called. "You don't want to go back in there right now. It's oppressive. You can come. I just need some peace and quiet." She pushed the button again. Mal remained silent while they descended to the main floor. He didn't say anything as they walked to the car. The quiet was a relief. He shut the car door for her without a word and said nothing as he put on his seatbelt. Elle turned on the car's GPS and punched in the hospital address. She backed out of the stall and headed toward the medical center, the only sound the voice of the GPS. The road looked different at night. She had to give her full attention to driving, until they passed into the industrial section where there was less traffic. This was the time she would have vented her feelings out loud, including a little screaming and name-calling. With Mal beside her, she couldn't, and his continued silence began to grate on her nerves. They passed the docks where dark, hulking outlines bobbed along the water's surface. Elle's pulse quickened, and a wave of nausea swept over her. She swallowed against the bile suddenly at the back of her throat. The whole stupid cruise had been her idea. All to give Lynn something to think about besides her dead dirtbag of a fiancé. And now what? Was Lynn dead too? Drowned out there? Her body being eaten by fish? Elle shuddered. The tightness in her throat grew until she could barely swallow. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. And there sat Mal like a silent lump stealing her release. "Are you always so quiet?" "I thought you wanted to get away from the noise." He raised a brow at the sharpness in her voice. Elle shot him a quick glance. How could she explain all the turmoil going on inside her? It was like someone was pumping air inside her, squeezing her from the inside out. It choked her, made it hard to swallow, to eat, to think. "I did." Elle tried to take a breath, but her chest hurt too much to get in much air, making it hard to talk. "But it was really an excuse to see my friend. Stupid hospital people won't tell me anything." Elle found the dark road difficult to see. She couldn't breathe. Jerking the wheel, she pulled to the narrow shoulder and stopped the car. There wasn't enough air. She had to get outside. "Hey, are you all right?" Mal reached for her as she struggled to unlatch the seatbelt with hands that didn't work right. Elle threw him off and freed herself from the belt. Opening the door, the rain blew in as she jumped out and supported herself against the car, clutching her chest. Was she having a heart attack? It pounded so hard it hurt, her lungs aching as they tried to pull in air. The edges around the car's headlights closed in and everything began to sway. Mal must have gotten out of his door because he appeared at the front of the car. "Are you?" "Hey!" He caught her as she started to collapse. Elle's entire body shivered and she clutched him, struggling for breath. He held her close to his chest, murmuring into her wet hair. Slowly, the warmth of his strong arms soothed her, easing her lungs to accept air. Cool, moist air. Her rigid, emotional control broke, and the nightmarish images she had been fighting to keep back flooded Elle's mind. Beautiful Yori, lying on the deck, his face a bloody mess. Her standing unyielding, bare, and vulnerable before the pirate's leering eyes. The other pirate hurting Wes. The dead captain lying on the deck in a pool of his own blood. And Lynn. Where was Lynn? A convulsive sob ripped through her chest. Elle didn't know how long she clung to Mal. The ocean breeze finally brought her back as it caused goosebumps to break out on her exposed skin. The rain had turned into a light mist. "You okay now?" Mal stroked her hair. He dropped his arms, but she felt cold where he no longer touched her. She shivered and snuggled closer against him, and Mal encircled her again. "Was this Yori your boyfriend?" Elle laughed, but it got caught in a hiccup and she choked. She shook her head in answer. "So who is he to you that you'd go off like this?" practically in the middle of the night, when you know the hospital won't let you in to see him. His question caused her chest to hurt again, but he must have sensed her agitation. His gentle but powerful arms pulled her a little closer. Not too tight, not awkwardly loose. The steady beating of Mal's heart calmed her. For the first time since that horrible day, she didn't feel like a prisoner of her own emotions. Yori is a friend who almost died to protect me. We were sitting together when one of the crewmen shot the captain in the head. Her words came out a whisper, almost lost against the sound of the surf across the road. I'd been asleep and woke up at the gunshot. I opened my eyes and the captain was on the deck. There was blood everywhere. Mal's arms tightened enough to ease her shaking. She wanted to stay there forever. They hit Wes with a rifle. That's what they did to Yori, too. Hit him in the face. Elle didn't want to think of that, ever again. They made us strip, the girls. They made us... She choked on a sob. It's okay. You don't have to tell me. Mal brought a hand to the back of her neck, and his fingers worked the tight muscles. But Elle did have to tell him. Now that she had spoken, she couldn't stop. When she was done, the weight of it all lifted. Not gone, not all better. Like sharing the burden of a too heavy load, she knew she could handle it now. Lifting her face, Elle looked up at Mal. In the light of the car's open door, his eyes held no pity, just sympathy and admiration. Without thinking, she lifted onto her tiptoes and touched her lips to his. Mal's hand on her neck froze. He didn't move, didn't kiss her back, but didn't push her away either. Elle pulled away, her face flooding with warmth. Mal dropped his hands. What must he be thinking of her? We should go. When she moved to go around him, Mal blocked her with his arm. Go where? Are you still determined to go to the hospital? Weary, Elle wanted nothing more than to lean into Mal again. She shook her head. Where was her usual strength? There were so many people back at the hotel who were on the edge emotionally, who needed someone with a clear head. Like Mal. Looking up at the calm concern in his expression, Elle understood. This time she wasn't the strong one. She was one of those people, the ones who needed help. Elle? Mal tilted his head as he watched her. Why are you here alone? I'm not alone. Why isn't your mother here with you? He brushed aside a strand of hair the breeze had blown into her eyes. I told her not to come. Why? Mal frowned. She'd worry about me. Do you think she's not worrying about you now? Elle looked up, a sick feeling growing in her stomach. She hadn't even talked to her mother except the one time. You've been through a terrifying experience, and it's not over. Mal touched her shoulder. You pretend you're untouched, but I've been watching you. Even someone as strong as you needs help sometimes. There was no accusation in either his tone or expression. Once again, she thought she saw admiration in his eyes. It didn't make sense, especially her sudden insane desire to kiss him again. In the light of the open car door, Elle noticed for the first time his bedraggled appearance. The rain had soaked the poor man's hair, making it look a dark, close-fitting cap on the top of his head. His shirt clung to his chest. Looking down, she saw her own was doing the same. Self-conscious, Elle crossed her arms. I need to call my mom. Do you want me to drive? Mal asked with a hint of a smile. Nodding, she went around the back of the car and got in the passenger seat. Neither of them said anything else on the trip back to the hotel. Elle appreciated that he hadn't mentioned the kiss or taken advantage of her while she was vulnerable. Over the years, she had known plenty of men who would have. At the hotel, he opened her door and she got out. With it between them, she said, Thank you for understanding. I'm sorry about the... Even with his neutral expression, she couldn't bring herself to mention the kiss. Well, thanks for putting up with my little breakdown. You sure you're ready to go back into the fray? He held up the car keys. I can give these to Ashlyn. Thank you. Elle turned and headed toward the hotel. She would have to bring a towel out to dry the seats. Mal jogged to catch up with her, walking in silence. He still didn't seem uncomfortable with the quiet. Surprisingly, neither did Elle this time. Only when they got to her door did he say a quiet good night, and continue to the suite he shared with his brother's family. After a long, hot shower had washed away the remnants of her breakdown, Elle sat on her bed. Picking up her cell phone, she settled back and dialed the number. "Hi, Mom," Elle said when she heard the familiar voice. "Oh, sweetheart, how are you doing? I've been so worried." "Thank you, Mal." Chapter 4. When she woke, Elle did a long, easy stretch. What a nice dream she'd been having. She couldn't remember anything in particular except how good she had felt. It must have been wonderful. The window at the end of the room let in a sliver of light. Where was she? With the sudden memory, Elle bolted up in the bed, reaching for the clock. Nearly noon. How had she slept so late? She was still buttoning her blouse when she got to Ashland's suite. No one answered Elle's knock. Hurrying down the hall, she wondered if they were at lunch. The elevator door opened, revealing Ashland holding Kate's hand. "Elle, you're up." The two stepped out. "You look so much better. Did you just get out of bed?" "I did." Elle followed Ashland back toward their rooms. "Why didn't you wake me?" "Uncle Mal said to let you sleep. Can I open your door for you?" Kate held out her hand expectantly. Elle patted her jeans pockets. Nothing. "I left the card in the room." "You need some food anyway," Ashland said. "You can get a new card while you're down there." "I'm getting my swimming suit." Kate hopped backward toward their door. "Any news?" Elle kept her voice soft. "They started up the search again." Ashland smiled and followed her daughter. The lobby was busy. Elle made her way to the front desk. "I locked my key in my room." Elle gave the young man her room number. "I'll need identification." "It's all right, Alecki," Mal said behind her. "I can vouch for Miss Reinhardt."
"Ah, okay, Mr. Armstrong."
Alecki nodded to Elle.
"I'll get right on it, ma'am."
She took a deep breath and turned to face Mal. He watched her, his expression. She wasn't sure how to read it. Like he knew a secret. He handed her a piece of paper. "What's this?" "Your friend's room number. They moved him from ICU this morning. He can have visitors now. And phone calls."
"Thank you."
She clutched the slip of paper to her chest, resisting the urge to throw her arms around his neck. With her friends, casual demonstrations of affection were common. After last night.
"Did you talk to him?"
"Just the nurse." His phone signaled a message and he glanced at it.
"How well did you know Braden? I mean—"
She stopped at the look on his face. "We were college roommates one year. Ashland and Darcy met through us."
So Mal wasn't just there for Darcy. "Lynn and I have been best friends since kindergarten. I need to call the hospital and then check on the Norths."
Mal held up his phone. "Ashland says you need to eat first." Elle started to argue, but he pointed to the phone as though the text message would refute any argument she could make.
"Fine."
Elle thought she sensed his eyes on her as she walked to the dining room. But when she looked back, he was gone. She hurried, hoping to sit with the Norths, but they were just leaving so Tammy could rest. Elle ordered a sandwich and sat at a table by herself. After she pulled out her cell phone, Elle held it, surprised at her shaky hands. She set the piece of paper Mal had given her on the table and dialed the number, relieved when the operator didn't hesitate to connect her to Yori's room.
"What do you want?"
A man's voice said, harsh and angry.
"I'm sorry,
Had Mal given her the wrong number?
Elle, don't hang up.
That was Yori?
Are you okay?"
I am now. Are you?
Just like the night before with Mal, Elle found herself blabbing everything. Almost everything. She did manage to keep her mouth shut about Mal, and that embarrassing kiss. Yori didn't speak until she finally had nothing else to say.
No word on the catamaran?
"They're still searching."
She couldn't bring herself to say she didn't know how long they would keep on.
"But how about you? The nurses wouldn't tell me anything."
When he started talking about his injuries, Elle pushed aside the plate the waiter had just brought her.
She was glad she hadn't been able to get anyone to tell her anything. If she had been stressed enough to fall apart last night, how much worse would it have been if she had known how awful Yuri's injuries were? Mal appeared at her table and slipped into the chair opposite her. Looking at her uneaten food, he shot her a disapproving look. "You sound really tired, Yuri. I should let you rest. I'll call you again and we'll come and see you." Elle set her phone next to the plate and picked up a cooling French fry. Why had Yuri been so angry when he had answered the phone?
"You going to eat that fry?"
"Why, you want it?" She pointed it toward Mal. "I'm not very hungry." He pushed the plate a little closer to her.
"You need to eat more than a potato."
He pointed to her sandwich. "Go away, I can feed myself." Elle rose with as much dignity as her short frame could muster and indicated the restaurant entrance. She wanted to smack the sly grin off his face, but he didn't say anything, merely stood, gave her a mocking and surprisingly accurate old-fashioned bow, and left. Different from the one Yuri always gave, but still nice. She sat again and picked up a sandwich half. Taking a bite, she remembered the first time she had met Yuri at the departure party on the ship. He had bowed and kissed her hand. His act had been courtly, while Mal's had been soldierly. Elle took another bite. Yes, soldierly. Why would Darcy's brother know how to do an old-fashioned soldierly bow? There were a lot of things she didn't know about Mal. Why had the urbane, mother-henish, old-fashioned soldier bowing totally kissable? Elle tossed the last of the sandwich to the plate and took a deep breath. She stared at the plate. Had she really eaten nearly all the food? Taking a sip of water, Elle realized she felt better. A good night's sleep, talking to her mother and to Yuri, and some food in her stomach had made a huge difference. Once she returned to her room, Elle wasn't sure what to do. Over 2 days of waiting, everyone had made a habit of gathering in the living room of Ashland's suite. With the Norths resting, there was no need for her to make a showing there. From her window, Elle considered the hotel's pool area. The sun shone, and a little girl darted out from the shelter of the building toward the water. Elle recognized Kate, followed by Ashland, who ran to catch up with the child before she reached the pool. Elle had to get outside, but for once she didn't want to be around people. She put her sandals on again and headed for the elevator. On the main floor, she decided to go out the back way, toward the parking lot. She could get to the beach that way and avoid the press in front of the hotel. At first, it felt strange to wander the beach, now full of happy tourists. The shouts of playing children reminded her that life carried on. It lifted her spirits. Staring in the distant horizon, Elle could believe it possible for the catamaran to appear there and sail ashore, with everyone safely aboard. She stood for a long time, the water washing against her toes, drawing the stress from her with each outgoing wave. The breeze blew through her hair and ruffled her dress. At the sound of approaching feet, Elle looked over her shoulder. Her heart did a funny little flip-flop at the sight of Mal. He came to stand beside her and nodded his head. It reminded her of that soldierly bow. "Where did you learn to do the—" She tried to imitate the motion. "Oh, that," he chuckled. "I'm a history buff." "Any particular time period?" "Civil War." Mal glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "I'm a reenactor." "Reenactor?" Elle turned to face him. Her curiosity piqued. "You reenact history? Like at Williamsburg?" "Battles, mostly. We consider ourselves living historians." Elle searched her mind for anything she could remember about it. It wasn't much. "I get that reaction sometimes." Mal gave her a wry grin. "What?" "Speechlessness." "No, I was just thinking," Elle said. "Is this a hobby?" "Yes. We do more than reenact battles, though. Things like school visits and parades. Our organization raises money to preserve Civil War battle sites, too. I can't be involved as much as I'd like." "I'm impressed." Elle couldn't help wondering what he looked like in uniform. Did he wear blue or gray? "Which side?" "What?" "Are you Confederate or Union?" "Union, of course. My third great-grandfather was a 1st Long Island volunteer." Mal pointed to her neck.
You're getting sunburned.
You too. Elle indicated his nose. I forgot to put on sunscreen before I left the hotel. If Lynn was here, she'd chew me out. With that simple comment, it all came crashing back. Did you know she's crazy about Braden? Elle tried to swallow the lump in her throat. Without a word, Mal pulled her against him, holding her as he had the night before. He didn't say anything, but she could sense powerful emotion coming from him. Had he been like this last night and she too messed up to realize it? Had he given her support when he needed some himself? Elle didn't hesitate but wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her head against his chest. This time she didn't take. She gave. Where he had been quiet as she had cried the night before, she talked. Braden was always watching people on the ship, you know. When I first met him during the safety briefing, he was noticed by the cutest old couple. He got Maria, she's with them on the catamaran, to confess that she won the cruise on a radio contest. Braden played the piano on the cruise's talent show with Maria's boyfriend, Jimmy. He's on the catamaran, too. Elle's voice broke, but she pressed on. Braden and Lynn played the piano together. I loved listening to them. And Yori and Braden are friends, too. The tension in Mal's body eased as she talked, and Elle slowed the gentle massaging of his back. She looked up, and this time the kiss was natural. His lips were soft as they met hers, gentle and warm. "Thank you," he whispered. Elle didn't know what to say, but the look in his eyes made her feel like she might melt. It wasn't a lusty look. Oh, there was warmth there, enough that just thinking about kissing him again made her toes tingle. But there was something else. No man had ever looked at her like that. To hide her confusion, Elle turned her head and rested it again on his chest. She was sure he must feel the thrashing of her heart, but she didn't care. The moment was an oasis in the crazy storm of her life, and she wasn't going to overthink it. They watched the ocean for a while longer. Finally, Mal slid his fingers through hers, and they walked back to the hotel. As he had the night before, Mal walked her to her room. They hadn't said much on the way back, and he didn't speak at the door either. He held her gaze as he lifted their joined hands to his lips, dropped them, and turned to leave. Elle could hardly catch her breath as he stepped away. It was all happening too fast. It scared her. She finally understood why Lynn had pushed Braden away. Elle wanted the connection with Mal to mean something, more than two people finding comfort during a tough time. When this was all over, she would return to Colorado Springs and Mal to New York. She'd never see him again. "Mal, wait," she cried when he was halfway to his door. Her frozen body finally obeyed her, and she moved toward him. He turned around. She ran to him and pulled his face down to hers. There was nothing soft about that kiss. "Sorry," she said at last. Mal shook his head as though trying to get his brain to work again. Elle went up on her tiptoes and brushed his lips again. She whispered, "If I've learned anything from this, it's to grab life with both hands." She spun and dashed to her door, refusing to look back. Chapter 5. During the next 2 days, Elle's burden seemed lighter. It wasn't that the worry had lessened, but that she felt stronger. Whenever her fears seemed about to consume her, she would look at Mal. He would immediately say she needed some fresh air, grab her hand, and take her to the beach. He only held her when it was really bad. How he knew, she didn't ask. Mal even went with her to the hospital, though he insisted on staying in the car. "Won't you please come in and meet Yori?" "Nope." Mal pulled out his cell and started playing a game. "You were able to talk to me about what happened, but I doubt he would." Elle saw the truth in his words. Leaning over, she gave Mal's cheek a quick peck and got out of the car. Walking to the building, she wondered which room was Yori's. How bad would he look? The image of the gaping wound on his cheek still haunted many of her nightmares. She couldn't shake the guilt that Yori had fought with a pirate to protect her. "Mr. Virtanen was just given his pain medication," a nurse said. "He's asleep. Can I just see him for a minute? I won't bother him, I promise." The nurse considered her for a second before nodding. The protectiveness of the staff made Elle feel better. At the door, she paused and took a deep breath. It was worse than she had feared. She stared at him as he lay asleep in the hospital bed, an IV attached to one arm, and a finger monitor cable leading up to the machinery. The steady beeping sounded weak and unsteady for such a young and vibrant man. The knot in Elle's stomach tightened again for the first time since her breakdown with Mal. The huge bandage on Yori's cheek wasn't large enough to cover the black and blue advancing up from the gauze and around his swollen nose and eye. The inflammation, combined with the bulky dressing, distorted his face, turning it into a misshapen mockery of Yori. Elle remembered him on the ship. Even in casual clothing, he had been beautiful. But when he had dressed in a tux for the formal dinners, he had taken her breath away. Everywhere he had walked on the ship, strangers would stop to watch him. What would happen to him now? She ran from the hospital. Mal leapt from the car and dashed to her. What happened? He took her by the shoulders and shot a glare back at the hospital. Did he? No. Elle pressed against him, resting her head on his chest. Mal put his arms around her. He's sedated, she whispered. I guess I thought he would look better. I'm sorry, Elle. I feel so horrible this happened to him. She lifted her face so she could see Mal's, hoping he would understand. What he thought of her had come to mean a lot to her. But what would have happened to me if he hadn't? I've never been obligated to someone like this before. His life will never be the same again. She was especially quiet that evening when the group gathered by the hotel pool. Jack played in the water with Kate, but his responses to the little girl rang false. After a few more minutes, Kate told her grandfather she was tired. He helped her dry off, and she went to lie on the towel by her mother's lounge chair. Jack stood by the pool, staring off in the distance. Elle recognized his stance. The hotel was in the way, but the beach and the horizon were in the direction he looked. Was he searching too, hoping to see the catamaran off in the distance, bringing home his son? Elle scanned the pool area for Mal. He would have known right away what she wanted. She grabbed a towel. I'm going to the beach, she said to Ashlyn. Using the back exit, Elle made her way to the public area, avoiding the press by mixing with a couple of families walking to the seafront. She went to her usual spot where the shallow shore seemed to stretch forever. The muscles in her neck relaxed, and she curled her toes in the warm water. Staring into the distance, she let the soothing surf work its magic on her. Elle loved the feel of the warm breeze on her skin and the way it ruffled her hair. The water pulled the sand out from under her bare toes. She watched the horizon for a shadow. Any smudge could be a boat, and sometimes it was. Not the catamaran. Yet. But with every sighting, her pulse would quicken, her hopes rising. Was it them? The reason they had been gone so long could have been because their radio didn't work. Maybe they had run out of gas and were sailing the catamaran all the way back to American Samoa. Elle stopped toying with the wet sand. Lynn didn't know anything about sailing. Did Braden? Jimmy was a Texas boy, but his family ranch was near Houston. He might have gone sailing before. He could be helping Braden bring them safely home. No shadows appeared that day. When Elle's stomach growled, she turned and headed back to the beach, where she dried off her feet and slipped on her sandals. She looked back at the horizon. If they were sailing back, they must be getting close by now. Mal went with her to the hospital again. This time she was the one who decided he would stay in the car. Yori was awake and played dumb when she tried to apologize for his injury. Somehow, when he chewed her out for feeling responsible, she could almost believe him. It made her love him more. As she returned to the car, Elle wondered why none of his family had come to be with him. If she had been in intensive care, there was no way anyone could have kept her parents from her. She had wanted to ask him about it, but something in his manner had kept her from speaking up. Did he have no one? Well, she would fix that. I need to bring Yori his clothes, Elle said to Mal once she was in the car. You should have seen him trying to get comfortable in that horrible open-back hospital gown. Isn't his stuff in your room? Mal put the car in gear and backed up. Yes, but he mostly wore polo shirts on the ship. I think we need to get him a button-up shirt, so he can put it on without worrying about bumping his face. Elle grinned as an idea came to her.
What are you planning?
Just something to make him smile. Want to come shopping with me?
Sure.
They found out where the local mall was and drove to it. They passed by a couple shops before Elle stopped at a display of brightly colored touristy shirts and pulled one aside.
No,
Mal said. Why not? This is perfect.
I could see Ace Ventura wearing this.
Mal fingered the garish fabric, the brilliant blues, greens, and oranges almost fluorescent in the store's light. It should make him laugh. He needs to laugh. Elle pulled it from the rack. A polo shirt won't go over that monster bandage on his face. It has to be a button-up.
But that button-up?
He pointed to a display of business shirts.
How about one of these?
No, if he looks like a tourist, he won't stand out so much when he gets out of the hospital.
If you say so.
Elle's mood stayed high until she watched the weather forecast that evening. Another storm was coming. A big one. She went to her room window. The catamaran better hurry. After a restless night, Elle rose early and went to the beach to watch the sunrise. She couldn't stand still but paced back and forth, scanning the gathering clouds on the horizon. The last storm had missed the search area, but the new one would be a direct hit. If the Coast Guard didn't think it was safe for them to be out there, what were the chances a small catamaran would still be in one piece? The horizon showed no shadows. Please, Braden, bring her home.
Hey, thought I might find you here,
Mal said from behind her. Oh! Elle jumped and spun around. You startled me. Are the others up yet?
A few of them are. Russ called to say they'll stay in their room today.
Elle didn't wait for an invitation but slid under Mal's arm and cuddled against him. She loved the smell of him first thing in the morning. His aftershave, his crisply laundered shirt. It would be easy to stay there all day. What would I have done this week without you, Mal?
You would have done fine.
Right. Elle thought about her little breakdown. What if she had made that first drive to the hospital alone? She turned in Mal's arms so her back was to him. He clasped his hands in front of her, and she leaned back and peered at the horizon.
You ready to take that awful shirt to Yori?
Mal asked after a few minutes. Elle giggled. He'll hate it.
Then why do it? Won't he be mad?
Yori, he'll get over it. She pulled free and took Mal's hand, drawing him toward the hotel.
You driving this time, or should I?
He asked when they reached the hotel lobby. I think I should go alone again. As supportive as Mal had been when she had left the hospital that first time, it had still weighed on her that he was in the car, waiting. This time she didn't want to be pressured to hurry. Mal scowled but didn't argue. By the time Elle was on the road, it had begun to sprinkle. She tried not to think of what the storm would mean for the search, focusing her thoughts on Yori instead. At first, the visit went well. Yori was finally free of the IV. Elle thought that would brighten his mood, but he became angry with her when she avoided looking at his face. She had seen his anger on the pirate ship, but never directed at her. Elle played the Lynn card and copped a chiding schoolteacher attitude, or perhaps it had been a big sister attitude. Either one, she got him to put on the clothing she had brought. When he came out of the bathroom, he really did look ghastly in the shirt. The only good thing was the garish colors didn't conflict with the bruising on his face. Is this the ugliest thing you could find? You won't have to fit it over your head, Elle sighed. Her joke had been an epic fail. She should have listened. Anyway, Mal and I think it'll help you blend in better once you leave the hospital.
Mal?
Yori eyed her, his expression showing real interest for the first time. He's Darcy's brother. Elle could feel her cheeks getting warm. He's the family spokesman for the press. Yori gave her a funny look, but he didn't say anything. Elle was updating Yori on her day when a male nurse entered the room. He started to leave, but Yori waved him in. The nurse handed Yori a plastic cup with his medication.
I'm so sorry.
What do you mean?
Yori asked.
About them calling off the search.
What? They both leapt to their feet. No. Elle pulled the phone from her purse, but it rang before she could dial. Ashlyn, don't tell me. They called it off. Ashlyn's voice came out as a high squeak that broke at the end. There must be someone we can call. Elle grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I'll be right there. She paused at the door, staring back at Yuri, whose face was painted with the same despair she felt. She ran back and threw her arms around him. I wish you could come with me. Same here. Yuri hugged her tight. Don't worry about me, okay? Don't be an idiot. She kissed his cheek and ran from the room. Elle had to dash through the rain to get to the car, the same stupid rain that was causing the Coast Guard to call off the search. She started the car but leaned her head against the steering wheel, wishing Mal was with her. If the Coast Guard couldn't be talked into continuing the search once the storm had passed, she would be going home without Lynn. Elle's head hurt as she looked out the hotel window. She felt betrayed. All her hope had been worthless, and the things she had refused to consider had happened. They were getting ready to stand united before the press, all but the Norths and Jack Randolph. Once the Coast Guard had made it clear the search for the catamaran was over, the three had taken the first flight back to the States. When she had called Yuri to tell him about it, he had sounded almost desperate. With him scheduled for release, the press was already staked out at the hospital. She had turned the phone over to Mao, who had suggested Yuri join them. A cab drove up to the front of the hotel. Yuri got out. He's here, Elle shouted. Hotel security hurried over to the cab. They made a path through the press and escorted Yuri inside. You ready to go down? Elle turned to see Mal standing in the doorway. Darcy appeared at his side. Coming, she said. Elle stood between Ashlyn and Yuri, trying not to cry. It was bad enough she had already done so much that morning and her face was swollen and red. Mal stepped to the microphone. We would like to offer our gratitude to the U.S. Coast Guard and to the wonderful people of American Samoa who have, at great risk, searched for our loved ones. While the official search has been called off, we plead with sailors and passengers alike to be watchful. We have not given up hope. Thank you. Some reporters shouted out questions when Mal turned away, but the Coast Guard public information officer stepped to the mic to answer them. Mal came to stand by his brother. When the questions were over, they posed for a group picture for the press. A large van filled with their luggage waited for them at the back of the hotel. Kate sat next to Mal, leaving Yuri and Elle the back seat. It was just as well. Mal had seemed distracted since receiving the news. He must be distancing himself from her already. The van pulled away from the hotel and she stared at the beach she had haunted the last week. It would be strange to return to landlocked Colorado. She had thought the horizon to be a friend, one that would return Lynn. With no wreckage, no bodies, how would they ever know what had happened? The kind people at the airport made a small conference room available to them while they waited for their plane. Yuri stretched out on one of the sofas, and Ashlyn and Darcy arranged for some food. Elle found herself staring through a window again, this time looking out at the tarmac. Her heart felt empty. How could she ever merge her life before the cruise with the bleak future? The smell of Mal's aftershave and the sound of his footsteps warned of his approach. Now she had lost him, too. Why couldn't they have met in different circumstances? He stepped beside her and put his hand on her shoulder. Elle watched his reflection in the glass. No smile. In fact, he seemed a little nervous. Elle, Mal whispered, look at me. With the hand on her shoulder, he used gentle pressure to turn her toward him. I can't say goodbye to you. He brushed aside a strand of hair. Can I call when we get home? A tiny glimmer of hope returned, spreading over her heart and easing a tiny bit the ache there. She slid her fingers into his. Yes.
Thank you for listening to Hope's Watch. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to know when new audiobooks or other fun videos are available.
This has been Hope's Watch, Safe Harbors Book Number 1.5, written by Donna K. Weaver, narrated by Tristan Hunt. Copyright by Donna K. Weaver. Production copyright 2016 by Donna K. Weaver.